Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 172. Reviews of My Degeneration, Aliceheimer's, Pencilhead number 1, and The Cask of Amontillado. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two people with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this week's review episode, we're going to be talking about 3 or 4 recent titles. We're going to begin by discussing a couple of recent books from the graphic medicine series out of Penn State. After that, we're going to be looking at issue number 1 of Ted McKeever's Pencilhead. And then we're going to wrap up with the latest adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Cask of Amontillado. But before we get into that fun talk, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off of the cover price, but often the discounts can get more impressive than that.
Get me the smelling salts. Woo! This month, Discount Comic Book Service has one of the comics we'll be talking about today at great savings. It's issue 1 of Ted McKeever's Pencilhead. It's on sale for the low price of $2.98, which is 40% off of the cover price. Also, we're going to be talking about sort of gothic comics, and if you are interested in reading more Edgar Allan Poe, they do have, for $6.98, the classic illustrated version of The Gold Bug and Other Stories. These are comics that I'm very fond of. Sometimes the illustrations are a little cheesy, but they're interesting, and that's 30% off the cover price. So there's a couple really great titles out there you might want to pick up after today's show.
Exactly, Gwen. It's a great place to get comics. I know we're at the tail end of January, but you can still get the January specials if you go to the website right now and put it in order. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Gwen and Derek sent you. And you know, Gwen, as our listeners are waiting for their comics to arrive from DCB Service, they should probably sit back and enjoy a great cup of coffee. And you know what kind of coffee they can brew?
Tell me, Derek, what kind?
That from our other sponsor, which is Just Coffee Co-op. They have a great selection of coffees, all of which are 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified. Also, they roast to order. They do everything in small batches. There is no mass production.
It's wonderful. And you know what else they have, Derek?
What's that?
Let me tell you. They have chocolate.
Yow.
They have organic divine chocolate, which you can buy by the bar or the box, which I would strongly advise. And if you're interested, here's where you go. You go to justcoffee.coop, C-O-O-P, and when you've put in your order in the coupon area, just type in all capital letters, comics, that's C-O-M-I-C-S, for 10% discount. You'll be basically drinking something you can feel good about, and you'll be helping us here at the Comics Alternative.
That's right. Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great way to get caffeinated. So, Gwen, this is the first time you and I have actually spoken. Obviously, we've emailed since the new year. Are you getting into the swing of your spring semester?
Sort of. It has been an intense start. I'm teaching 2 online courses, but I will tell you they're online hybrid. But what's really exciting and something that we all have to look forward to in my class is that comics creator Barry Deutsch is going to be visiting us via Skype to talk about his drawing later in the semester. I'm going to be teaching Hereville 3, his wonderful new comic, and it's going to be really exciting. So I have that to look forward to, plus the warmer weather. How are things going for you?
Going really well. We're in our, I guess it's second week, or we're about to enter our third week of classes. By the time this goes up, we'll be in my third week of classes. and a couple of classes that I've taught before, but I nonetheless enjoy teaching, even though I've taught them several times before. This time around in one of my courses, I am using a larger theme of webcomics for our discussion. So all of the assignments that the students have to do throughout the semester has to have something in some way to do with webcomics. So this is a learning experience for both them and for me, because they're introducing me to a number of webcomics titles that I wasn't familiar with. And of course, that's the vast majority of webcomics that are out there, because there are tons. Well, that sounds like a good idea for a future show. Yep.
Some of their suggestions. That would be great.
Yeah. When Sean and I do our monthly webcomic episodes, we encourage listeners to send us recommendations. And often they do. But this is an additional way for me to get recommendations, what my students read.
Well, that sounds like some pretty fun grading there, too.
Yeah. Well, Gwen, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the reviews, there are a few things that we need to tell listeners, kind of announcements and shout-outs. One of those is the announcement that the Comics Alternative now has a Goodreads account. Now, we have a number of accounts on a variety of social networking sites because we try to get out there in terms of social media. And I don't know if we'll use it effectively or not, but I went ahead and set up a Goodreads account for us. And I know you have a Goodreads account.
I do, and I need to use it more, actually. Mm-hmm. I have friends who put down every book they've read, and I often go and look at their suggestions, and I found it to be really helpful, so I suppose I should be returning the favor. And this could be a really great service for our listeners, too.
Exactly, and what I think that I'm going to do, because I just set this up, is every week put up the books that we are reading on the review show. We could do it with the other monthly shows, for instance, like yours and Andy's Young Readers monthly shows. And then we'll just mark them as read after those episodes go up. And maybe we could use Goodreads for kind of a reading group, reading club with our listeners who want to participate. I don't know if that would work. Because this could function as something sort of like a forum, and we have a forum on the Comics Alternative. It's not used that often, and I think that's largely our fault for not really, utilizing what it actually could be. But nonetheless, we have a Goodreads account, and if our listeners are Goodreads users, maybe they can contact us and give us suggestions of how to use that platform effectively.
Sounds great. I think that would be fun, actually.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to do is to thank a couple of new Patreon supporters. Over the past 2 or 3 weeks, we have 2 people who have decided to support the Comics Alternative by giving us $1 a month, and we want to give them a shout-out. They are Paul Spence and Elim, or Alim. I'm not sure how you pronounce her name, but it is spelled Eylem, and that's the only name that I see on her Patreon account. But to both Elam and Paul, thank you very much for supporting us. And it's great. As we said before, you can support us for any amount, and no amount is too small. So these guys giving $1 is great. If you support us for $5 a month, then you become an official Patreon supporter or patron. I will list your name on our website and give you frequent shout outs on the show. And then for those of us who support us on the $15 a month level, you get all the other attention, plus you get a supplemental episode once a month that's about 25, 35 minutes long that Kunka and I record, where we more or less freeform, jazz-like, of but not near as melodic, of what we're reading, comics-related discussions, pop culture, things of that sort. So that's always fun to do.
Sounds great. Thanks to them so much. That's wonderful.
Yeah. So, in fact, if you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see links to our Patreon account. So consider supporting us on Patreon. And, the third thing that I'd like to say before we get to the reviews is also Patreon related, but it's not our Patreon account. I'm going to ask people to support because we do that often. But this is someone that we've had on the show before. Megs Fitzgerald, I spoke with her a couple of months ago in an interview, the release of her new book, Long Red Hair. And previously, she had written a book called Photo Booth, which is absolutely phenomenal, just as Long Red Hair is. But she just started a Patreon account. So if you like Meg's work, if you want to see where she's going next and what she's currently working on, check out her Patreon account at www.patreon.com/Megs. And Megs is spelled Meags. So there you go.
Great.
Well, Gwen, let's begin talking about the titles for this week. And we're going to start with two recent, or one will be published in the next couple of months, but two titles from University or Penn State's graphic medicine series. And specifically, we're going to be discussing My Degeneration, A Journey Through Parkinson's. This is written, with also art, by Peter Dunlap-Shohl. And then Aliceheimer's Alzheimer's Through the Looking Glass, written and illustrated by Dana Walrath. Now, we're going to start off with My Degeneration because this came out back in late October. And Aliceheimer's will not be coming out until April. So, but we want to say a few things about that. But let's get into My Degeneration: A Journey Through Parkinson's. What did you think of this?
I loved this comic, both in terms of the way that the author presents Parkinson's, in terms of his sense of humor, the way that he separates out both sort of what he went through being diagnosed, but then it almost becomes a handbook of things to know if you have been diagnosed, or if you know someone who has, or if you're simply interested in the way that Parkinson's disease manifests itself. It's done in a way that you just keep reading. It's not a dry textbook by any stretch of the imagination. And from a technical standpoint, Dunlap-Shohl, who was a former political cartoonist for the Anchorage editorial cartoonist for the Anchorage Daily News for 25 years, he's so technically smart. And so the comic is beautiful to look at, and I found it to be very heartwarming in some ways, very realistic, and I don't know. I just think it's just one of the best comics I've read all year. And that's saying something because actually, even though we're only in January, I've read about 15 or 20 comics this month. And this one stands right at the top for me.
Oh, yeah, I agree with everything you said. And, maybe we should point out that this graphic medicine series is relatively new. And I'm going to read just a little blurb that we see on the inside copyright information pages that describes the series. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It says, books in the graphic medicine series are inspired by a growing awareness of the value of comics as an important resource for communicating about a range of issues broadly termed medical. For healthcare practitioners, patients, families, and caregivers dealing with illness and disability, graphic narrative enlightens complicated or difficult experiences. And so, I think that goes a long way of contextualizing what my degeneration is all about. So this is not only an introduction into not so much Parkinson's, but the effects of Parkinson's. But even more importantly, it's about the experiences of a sufferer who is going through this. And so it is his firsthand account of what he had learned along the way. And I think this could be extremely helpful for others who are diagnosed with Parkinson's.
Yeah, absolutely, especially because he gets at some of the specific day-to-day things that he's contended with that don't show up on an official list of symptoms, but are actually quite useful. One example is he talks about these moments where he will suddenly stop being able to move. Now, that is something that sort of freezing up is one of the symptoms. If you sort of look at any medical book or online and Google it, that you're going to see that. But then he draws this wonderful page where he talks about the strategy that he used when he and his family were on vacation, and they deplaned, and all of a sudden he had one of those moments where he couldn't move, but he figured out that he could walk backwards.
Yeah.
And so the book is filled with these interesting coping strategies that he uses so that when he's confronted with a symptom, he finds a way around it. And in fact, he has a whole page of different ways that he walks at different times, depending upon how his body is reacting. And I think for someone who is experiencing this disease, perhaps has just been diagnosed, this would be the kind of information that would be reassuring and would let you know, there's a way to work around some of these things that are going to happen to me. I found it to be a very hopeful book in that respect.
Exactly. And, as you pointed out, this is the perfect text for those who have been diagnosed and are suffering from Parkinson's. And it does give them a sense of kind of fellowship in a variety of ways. In essence, what Dunlap-Shohl is saying is, I've been through this, I'm continuing to go through this. These are some of the things that I have found, for instance, like those movement methods that you pointed out. These are some strategies that I've learned along the way, and also things that he has learned from other people. At the same time, this is a great book to educate those of us who are not really familiar with Parkinson's. And I have to admit, I knew almost nothing of Parkinson's disease before reading this book. I mean, to show you how lame I am in terms of my Parkinson's knowledge, if you'd asked me before reading this, what Parkinson's is all about, I could probably give you a very, very rough description of some of the symptoms, and then the name Michael J. Fox. And maybe Janet Reno. Other than that, though, I knew nothing about Parkinson's. And what Dunlap-Shohl does is he goes through the process from his perspective, but he also does a great job at articulating this for those of us who are ignorant of what all this entails. And not only from a medical and from a medical position, or even when it comes to its taxonomy, but the experience of having to deal with this. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like going through the things that he articulates here, both in words and images. He does a really good job, I think, of allowing his readers to slip inside of him and to see things from his perspective.
I agree. And, if our readers pick up their copy and they were to turn to pages 74 and 75, there's some really nice things going on here that I think would be not only of interest to people who are interested in the medical side, but for comic scholars as well. It's a spread where he's talking about a surgical procedure that he's going to have. Mm-hmm. It's a procedure that does end up being successful and allows him to have much more flexibility of movement. But at the beginning, it's called Deep Brain Stimulation, the Pacemaker for the Brain, is this large illustration. And he goes through and he gives you, first of all, in depth, an understanding of exactly what will happen during the surgery. And then the rest of the comic panels that surround it show him being prepared for the surgery. And then if you turn the page, you see him having it and the outcome of it. And, you know, you were saying, I too, Derek, didn't know a great deal of the specifics of this. But if let's say I were in medical school and I were learning this in a formal way, I would love to have this illustrated guide to that surgery. You know, it's interesting because Dana Walrath, we're going to be talking about her in a minute, her Aliceheimer's, her job is to basically humanize the med school experience for medical school students. And there's something that she said that is the typical pedagogy for medical school, which is see something, do something, teach something. So a med student's progression involves observing a procedure, then doing it themselves, and then being able to describe it to someone else. Well, this drawing here would be incredibly useful to anyone studying medicine, not just for Alzheimer's disease, but it could be extrapolated to almost any condition. In fact, it's interesting. This book reminds me a lot of a book that we reviewed, and also I reviewed with Andy, The Human Body Theater, because in a way that too, although it's for children, it includes very in-depth illustrations of a procedure or the steps that one might go through for a procedure. And once I've seen something and been able to sort of observe it, then I feel like I know it better too. And so I really enjoyed this particular spread. It stood out for me, both for its technical brilliance, but also because I think I could articulate to someone else what that surgery entailed.
Exactly, and I'm glad that you brought up Human Body Theater. I know that's one that back in the fall when you and I were doing that publisher spotlight on First Second. I mean, that was a great text. It was one of the highlights of our conversation, and that is a book that doesn't really, I mean, I guess in a broad sense, it does tell a story, the story of the human body and how it functions. But It's really not a narrative in the way we usually think of stories, right? And I have to say that my Degeneration is somewhat similar to that. Now, when I first started to read this, its first chapter, Diagnosis Blues, here we have Dunlap-Shohl. We see him putting on his running shoes. He has his trusty dog with him, and he's going for a run in Alaska in a wooded area, and he is telling us through these thought bubbles. And by the way, a comic with thought bubbles. Hey, who would have thunk? We don't see much of that anymore. That he is wondering if he finds a bear, if he would let the bear just go ahead and kill him. Because that way he wouldn't be committing suicide. In other words, he would just be letting nature, so to speak, take its course. His family wouldn't have to worry about caring for him and everything that goes along with his eventual, as he puts it, degeneration. But then he decides against this, and he imagines what it would be like if he had actually seen a bear and what the reaction of both him and the bear would be. And I'm thinking in particular of page 5, and you can see where his political cartoon background comes into play here. It becomes very cartoony and comical when, you know, the scenario where he meets the bear. And I really enjoy that and appreciate it. But I mentioned this opening chapter because when I first started this book, I thought, okay, this is going to be a graphic memoir. In other words, we start off with a moment in his life, and then we're going to get an overall story of his discovery of this disease, what it meant to him, maybe what eventually led to these thoughts of meeting a bear and letting the bear kill him, and then his ongoing experience in his life as, you know, he learns to deal with this, I think over a decade's period, right? Because he tells us toward the end that he's had this for about 10 years. But actually, this is not a memoir. Because after you get past that first section, then we go into a series of other chapters. For instance, learning to speak Parkinson's, where he introduces us to a variety of terms that, most of which are specific to the disease, some of which I didn't know.
Right.
The third chapter is called Interview with the Killer, where he imagines confronting a personification of Parkinson's. And talking with him about why are you doing this, what do you get out of it, so on and so forth. And then the remainder of the chapters are set up almost as topics in other ways. And there is a story, his life story, that's going on behind everything that he's writing here, but it's not a memoir in a strict sense. This is more of an informational text like the Human Body Theater. And, we mentioned something that patients and also relatives of people with Parkinson's could learn a lot from. This is more of an overtly educational type text than an autobiography or a memoir.
Yeah, and what's wonderful about it, though, and I think why I would recommend it to general readers, is that it's done so well that you never feel as if you're being taught something. Because, for one thing, I really think that Dunlap-Shohl has a great sense of humor. It comes through in the comics. Like the page that you were referencing, page 5. I mean, one of the scenarios is that, of course, the bear eats him. And rather than showing that, there's just this picture of this sort of schlubby bear. And he's the little speech bubble is "erp." I mean, there's just these really delightful moments scattered throughout the text that make it a joy to read. And in fact, as someone who has been a caregiver in the past and who also has had a few far more minor medical situations, which most of us do by the time we, reach middle age, there was still a lot to relate to in this story. I felt that it could be applicable to anyone who's really struggling with an issue that is going to always be there, even if it isn't as serious as Parkinson's. One example that I thought was both funny, poignant, and relatable was on pages 8 and 9, where Dunlap-Shohl talks about the different ways that doctors can tell you that you have something wrong with you.
Oh, yeah.
And it's every bad way that I have ever witnessed myself, heard other people talk about, but yet it's done with a certain amount of humor, which makes it not only bearable, but it kind of it makes it seem more universal.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say I really felt at one with the author at that point.
Right, but there's also that anger and irritation that comes through as well, but not in a way that is going to, I guess, take away from the effectiveness of what he's saying here. And I think it's that weird mixture of irritation and humor that goes into the early part of this book that I think makes it not only powerful, but very relatable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also really want to give props to the use of color in this text. There are some very, what I guess we'd call pretty dark and sad moments. The first pages that you were talking about, the background is in black, but later on when Peter is basically having this confrontation with Parkinson's on page 28, Parkinson's is depicted as this green-faced sort of monster with red eyes and little red emanata coming out of his head against this dark background. And he's standing over Peter as Peter's working on the elliptical, because one of the things that he's found is that if he exercises, it actually really helps with the symptoms. Mm-hmm. And Derek, there was this interesting moment of intertextuality for me here with a couple of comics. I mean, first of all, I couldn't help but thinking of Art Spiegelman's Mouse with Vladek on the exercise bike, sort of talking about the horrors of the Holocaust. And here's Peter on the elliptical with the horrors, or at least the challenges of Parkinson's standing over him. But also, it reminds me a lot of a number of comics that I've read, including, the one that's coming to mind. I'm trying to remember it because I just read it recently, and it's the point is that the Parkinson's personification is monstrous and engulfing, and it's really just an incredibly beautifully drawn spread with gorgeous use of color, some intertextuality. It's just a brilliant moment. And there's so many of these in this comic. I couldn't put it down, actually. Once I started reading it, I had planned to read it in a couple of installments as I was reading a lot of other things. And I just gave that up and put up my feet and read the entire thing from cover to cover and was really glad I did.
Yeah. You mentioned the personification of Parkinson's. At the same time that he is monstrous, there's also something gentlemanly about him, I think, which makes him even more frightening. And I couldn't help but think, since we're getting literary, of Emily Dickinson's poem about death, because I could not wait for death. And so, here, even, I guess, it's Parkinson's, the personification is something like death or an eventual death. And he is, although at times presented as a monster, someone who is refined. He has a suit and a tie, a soft way of speaking at times, a hat when he is outside. But again, that makes him even more sinister than if he, in every representation in the book was, big, menacing, red-eyed, sharp-teethed.
I remembered the reference, Derek. You'd see, this is so me.
Okay.
I'll think of it. It's Nate Powell's "Swallow Me Whole."
Oh, "Swallow Me Whole," yes.
And towards the end, the engulfing frog, right, that just comes and swallows Ruth whole. That too, I saw there. So it's really yay me.
Yeah.
but and
this
in a
Parkinson
way,
is green as well.
Yeah. So, wow, deep.
Maybe this would be a good point to make a segue into Aliceheimer's, because, we've been talking about my Degeneration and Dunlap-Shohl's perspective. I mean, he's the one who's suffering. So we get his medical condition and the issues involved from the patient's perspective. But one of the great things about graphic medicine is that not all of their books are like that. There are some, for instance, The Bad Doctor and even one of its initial releases, Graphic Medicine Manifesto, where you get the graphic narrative from the perspective of the caregivers themselves, the doctors. And then the aforementioned Things to Do in a Retirement Home Trailer Park by Aneurin Wright. This is a book about what it's like to help care for a family member in a hospice-like manner. Even though Wright is not the one who is suffering, it is his, I believe, father who does so. It's about Wright's experience with helping his father deal with his terminal illness, and also coming to terms with his relationship with his father. Mm-hmm. Now, we have something similar to the latter with Aliceheimer's, because here, Dana Walrath is not the sufferer of Alzheimer's, but it's her mother, Alice, who has the condition.
That's right. And she's in an interesting subject position herself, Dana Walrath, because her job is she's a research assistant professor of family medicine at the University of Vermont College of Medicine. And her job, as she puts it in a wonderful TED Talk that I would encourage our listeners to access, because she does a really great job of describing this text and the impetus for it there as well. What she talks about is her job is to, in a way, bring the humanities into the medical school training. So she is an anthropologist who encourages students to understand the cultural and social aspects of medicine. And in her introduction to Aliceheimer's, she says something that I'd like to quote for us, because I think it will help us to think about what she's trying to do with this text. She talks about how for most people the diagnosis of Alzheimer's is a horror story. She says, people with Alzheimer's are perceived as zombies, bodies without minds, waiting for valiant researchers to find a cure. And she says for Alice, her mother, and for me, the story was different. Alzheimer's was a time of healing and magic. Of course, there is loss with dementia, but what matters is how we approach our losses and our gains. Reframing dementia as a different way of being as a window into another reality, lets people living in that state be our teachers, useful true humans who contribute to our collective good instead of scary zombies. And I thought that was really a very meaningful way of thinking about this text. I would say that in a traditional sense, Derek, this text reminded me a little bit more of a book of where the term collage makes more sense.
I agree, yes.
And I want to give a shout out to my current graduate student, doctoral candidate, Crystal Howard, who's writing an entire dissertation on collage, in which one part she talks about is comics collage. And here you have basically the way that the text is structured is you may have one or two illustrations drawn by Walrath, and then an entire page of text where Alice's story is told from that perspective. So you basically are asked to work back and forth between the images on one side of the page and the text, the sort of memoir aspect on the other side of the page.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you mentioned earlier the introduction, and one of the things I wanted to point out is this is quite a substantive introduction that Walrath provides for us. And so she definitely does set a very detailed context of what she's doing, why she's doing things the way that she is, and of course information about her mother and her relationship with her mother, as well as her relationship with her own art. And so I found that was very helpful in understanding where she's coming from here. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I wanted to point out is it strikes me, you and I were talking off mic in preparation for today's discussion, and we were wondering, is Aliceheimer's really a comic? Now, maybe you can call it a graphic narrative, and a graphic narrative is a term for comics, is not without its own problems. But I do think that graphic narrative is probably a better word here, because when we're looking at Aliceheimer's as a comic, well, we don't have, at least clearly, the kind of sequential nature that I think most people think of and use as a defining characteristic of comics. Although there is some kind of sequentiality going on, sometimes within certain images, and to some degree between and among the various illustrations in this book.
That's true. In fact, one that really stood out for me was on pages 14 and 15. On the left spread, Walrath is talking about her mother beginning to disappear, and she draws or creates that by cutting out pieces from Alice in Wonderland that she pastes together in the shape of her mother. And the text reads, "Alice is disappearing, soon there will be none." And where Alice's face had been in previous illustrations, it's now replaced by that text. Facing the page is another image that is amazing in its import. Basically, it's a column, and on one side of the column it says "Days with Alice," and on the other side it says "Days without Alice." And what this actually is, the first column includes 28,126 marks that Walrath has made for every day that that her mother lived, and she drew this on this image as basically a tribute to her mother. And when we sit there and we really think about it, if you were, I suppose, to go through, Derek, you could probably count those out and find that there were that many there. But it's almost a physical manifestation of her mother's life. And then in the other column, it's empty. And there's a text, there's a caption next to it that says, "None is hard to draw." Mm-hmm. And I really found those two panels and their juxtaposition to be more along the lines of that, and also to be just very deeply moving. It was one of the points where I just stopped, and it made me stop and contemplate, the significance of Alice's life. This is truly a memorial to her mom, and it's a beautiful one.
Exactly. And another thing that I love about this book, and this is... From what I gather, this is the first in what may be a series, what they call the Aliceheimer Project, is the metaphor of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And, on the one hand, this seems kind of overly obvious, but I think that the way that Walrath deals with that as a metaphorical lens through which to see her mother's experience makes perfect sense, and she does it effectively. You mentioned earlier that many of the illustrations that Walrath has of her mother, Alice, is collage-like, cutting up pages from Alice in Wonderland and using those as a robe that drapes her mother. And so we see her face and we may see her hands and her feet, but most of the body is this text, right? So it's right. Lewis Carroll's text is overlaid her mother in this sense, and that becomes the way that we see her experiences. And, as the subtitle suggests, it is like stepping through the looking glass to try to understand what it's like with an Alzheimer's patient. And Walrath meticulously goes through in the text sections, what her mother was experiencing, what she was forgetting. Even the humor, I think, comes out in places where, and I think this is one of the strengths of this book, is that Walrath doesn't ask us to pity her mother or to be overly sad. But, it's a somber text, of course, but there are moments of lightness where Walrath is finding the humor that her mother sees in her or saw in her own condition. And I think that was very touching.
I agree. And what links these two books together, I think, is that both take very seriously the emotional impact of illness on a person. These are not Pollyanna texts.
Right.
The person who is either the person who's diagnosed or the person who's witnessing the person who is diagnosed. There's not a sense of, well, let's just make the best of this in a kind of, surface way. But each text also shows the person who is either coping with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, finding ways to still incorporate joy in life and the sense of still being alive and an active, creative person. And I think that I found both of them to be really, to handle that sort of trope or that idea in a really sensitive way. So you're not feeling like, there's a criticism that sometimes is lodged against texts for children in which a child with a disability becomes sort of the teacher to all the other children, right? The golden child who can, through their suffering, teach something to other children. And those of us who study children's lit and who teach it, we try and help our own students to move away from viewing that as an ideal. Neither of these texts is that way. Both of them treat illness in a realistic way, treat the suffering and the stress that it causes in a realistic way, but also both of them emphasize creativity as one way to cope. And I found that to be really an interesting way of drawing and writing about illness.
Exactly. So, and I'm looking forward to seeing what future titles we can see from the graphic medicine series.
Absolutely. Derek, when we were talking about doing these, I did do a little bit of research as well. And it's interesting. The series originally was set up by academics who envisaged it as an opportunity for scholars to write about comics that dealt with medicine. But as they moved along and the editorial board really started to think about it, they decided to actually publish primary texts, and I'm so glad that they have.
Yeah. Now, we didn't mention this, but the series editors include Susan Merrill Squire, who's a professor of women's studies and English at Penn State University, and Ian Williams, who is a comics artist, clinician, and is the editor of graphicmedicine.org. And then they have a collection of other editors who work with the series. And so this is a very ambitious project.
And they're soliciting manuscripts. So if any of our listeners have been inspired by this, perhaps feel that they have a memoir in them that they would like to write about, they should definitely check out the Penn State website. There's a very detailed set of instructions for individuals who wish to submit. And they are actively soliciting new manuscripts.
Mm-hmm. Well, Gwen, let's make the transition from a relatively new series within the medium of comics to a creator who's been around for quite a while, Ted McKeever. He has a new miniseries from Image, Pencilhead. Issue number 1 came out last week, and we're going to be talking about Pencilhead number 1. Now, are you familiar with any of McKeever's previous works?
I am. I believe that when I was in grad school, so this is very long ago, I might have seen a copy of Metropole, and that I remember skimming through it. I was sort of into apocalyptic things back then. I was in grad school after all. And so that was really my main first entry into McKeever's work, but I'm betting you probably have read much more of his work.
Yeah, I have, and it's been a while. I mean, the last thing that I've read of his was the last series, Superannuated Man. And in fact, we reviewed issue number 1 of that. I looked this up back in June 2014. That was episode number 89 for those of you playing at home. So yeah, that's a little over, I guess, or about a year and a half ago. So it seems like a long time ago. It doesn't seem that long, really. And then before that, he had another Image series, Miniature Jesus, which was really interesting. And then those earlier series, you pointed out Metropole, but then he also had Eddie Current stories and then Transit. And in fact, Eddie Current, Metropole, and Transit you can find in these nice collections that Image has put out called the Ted McKeever Library. So if you've read Pencilhead number 1 and you really like what you see, it would be worth dipping into these other titles that we mentioned. But I think one of the reasons why, Gwen, you and I wanted to discuss Pencilhead is because this is supposed to be, I guess, a comic about creating comics. And in fact, on the front page, on the cover of Pencilhead number 1, I guess it's almost like a subtitle: oddball artists, twisted writers, demented editors, office politics, hamburgers, and a dead stripper. And so this is about the whacked out world of comics, again, as you can see on the front cover. And the protagonist is a character by the name of Poodwaddle. And I love the names of this story. And we see him at the very beginning working on a strip that turns quite dark and horrific, but then we realize that he's probably fallen asleep. Although by the time we get to the end of the comic, I really wondered if what we were witnessing was his nightmare-like dream world, or if this was actually something a little more realistic going on.
Yeah, and I think that I was immediately, when I got to the last page, I was like, where's the next issue? So I guess that's a testament to McKeever there. But I was wondering that as well. And here we have yet again another beast with large teeth that wants to engulf, right, the protagonist. So I guess there's a little bit of a theme there, unintentional on our part, but there it is. And in a way, this character is also experiencing malaise. It's just professional malaise, so it's slightly different. But nonetheless, the symptoms are there for Poodwaddle.
Yeah, and I think malaise is a good way of describing the situation that Poodwaddle is in. And also, there seems to be he seems throughout rather lackadaisical in his responses to those around him. From his friend, how do you pronounce his name? Luthis?
Yeah, I think that's it.
To his editor, Plots. And by the way, I love the fact that he named his editor Plots, or the publisher Plots. And of course, Plots is almost like a stereotypical, demanding, unrealistic, and almost savage publisher who's wanting things yesterday, who is concerned with the bottom line, making money, going on the cheap. And, Poodwaddle is offended when he takes in his latest work and then picks up his current paycheck, and given a complimentary copy of a comic that he is working on, seeing these large sound effects like zoom, boom, crunch, zap, or capo, I guess is one of those words, in his comic, like you'd find in a superhero narrative, except that's not a superhero comic that he's written. And he goes to Plotz and asks, he says, what the F? We'll keep this friendly. I won't say what the F is, but I'm sure our listeners can fill in the gaps there. And his editor points out that, hey, comic book readers love superhero stories. And so we put those sound effects in. But then Poodwaddle says, but I didn't write a superhero story. And then Plotz says, well, yeah, but by the time they get into the comic, they've already bought it, and that's what counts.
Yeah. And, it's funny in that scene because it's easy to really be drawn into looking at the images in a broad sense because Plotz is really unpleasant to look at. He, again, is one of these beasties with the large engulfing mouth. But there's a wonderful image early on when they're having this interchange where Plotz is shown in the foreground and his bookshelf is shown in the background. And if you look at the titles, they're pretty funny. There's Midnight Meh. There's Sucks and Violets. There's, Lame Dog. It's clear.
Samurai Puss.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's pretty funny that clearly this is a publishing firm that's just trying to sort of, it's like if you were a children's lit author about 5 or 6 years ago, if your book didn't have a werewolf, a zombie, or magic in it, it wasn't going to get taken seriously because publishers were just so desperate to find the next Harry Potter or Twilight. And it's sort of the same thing here, right? It's like appealing to an audience base that at least poor Poodwaddle isn't really trying to appeal to. And that's part of the conflict in the comic.
Yeah, exactly. And, when I mentioned earlier that he just seems to go with the flow, so to speak, without much reaction outside of the occasional, WTF response that I mentioned. And this is, we're reading from a PDF, so I do not know what page this is in the actual comic, but this is right before he leaves Plotz's office. And the narration in the last panel on this particular page is Poodwaddle utters, basically, Plotz and his assistant, who again is a know-nothing, has explained why they're doing what they're doing with those sound effects. And then the narration, Poodwaddle utters the one word any self-effacing freelancer says when he wants to keep on working. And then Poodwaddle says, fine. So again, he just goes along with it, rolls with whatever comes along in order just to get by. So he doesn't seem to be overly excited about what he's doing anymore. And the same seems to be the case with his friend Luthes. Luthes, again, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but Poodwaddle goes to meet him, in all places, a strip club where Luthes is eating. He says he's there for the burgers.
Yeah.
So it's like a pornographic McDonald's, which, may be a redundancy depending on what you feel about McDonald's. But and then something happens there to where one of the strippers seems to have died, and they run away back to Luthus's apartment, and then they have a conversation about where they're going with their art and maybe working together on a project. And then Poodwaddle goes home, takes the subway back, and then this is where we get to the ending that you had pointed out, that there seems like there should be more. Now, maybe not necessarily more in this first issue, but definitely more to the narrative. And in reading the very end of Pencilhead 1, I had the same feeling that I had in reading Superannuated Man #1, and that is I couldn't wait for the next issue to come out. Not only because of the suspense issue, but because the way that Ted McKeever writes, there's definitely an expectation of something more that is needed at the end of this first issue. So let's see this. And I don't want to suggest that this might read better in trade than in individual issues. I wouldn't suggest that at all. First and foremost, because I love the art of Ted McKeever and we need more of it. So definitely go out and get those single issues. But this is a 5-issue limited series, and the feeling that you and I may have at the very end when we see this dark, toothy, monster-like character creeping back into the narrative is what is next. And of course, we turn the page and we see a preview of another title that Image has going on, Power Lines, which is fine. But like you, it's like, well, where's the rest of this story?
Yeah. And, again, one of the things I found fascinating from the perspective of looking at this as a comic about writing comics is the subway ride itself. There's a moment in the ride when basically it's a whole sort of the panorama of the New York City subway system, essentially, and the people one finds on it, and how Poodwaddle uses these folks, sort of internalizes their situations, and then will use them in comics. And there's almost a beauty in the grittiness of that section of the comic that I thought was really evocative. So, as you say, just for the art alone in that section, the comic is definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you mentioned the almost like metafictional moments in this comic. In the subway ride, one of these weird characters that you see on the New York subway is a guy who, gets on the subway and he says, "Greeting to all you fine earthlings. Allow me to introduce myself. I am the man from Mars. I've traveled 2 billion miles so that I might share with you a most sad and personal story. You see, my wife and child are back on Mars, shoeless and starving." And of course, he's gonna, as many people who ride the subway do, try to entertain in hopes of getting a few bucks thrown to them to go away. But the potential metafictional element here is that this guy, this man from Mars, breaks out an instrument to entertain the crowd with, and it's not much of a crowd, and what at first looks like a clarinet is actually part of a clarinet. It's a broken clarinet, and Poodwaddle, we see him think, a broken clarinet? He's definitely a character that he's going to write, he says. And so this broken clarinet, the way that it looks, is not dissimilar from a pencil that Poodwaddle would use. And so here we have Poodwaddle, an artist, observing on the subway another artist,
right,
the man from Mars, attempting to entertain, but in a way that is kind of off kilter and truncated. So what might this say about Poodwaddle's art? I don't know.
Or just about the value of the artist in society as a whole.
Oh,
I think that's a really good point, Derek. And it's an interesting meta moment.
Yeah. So,
I kind of wanted to reach through the screen and give the poor guy $1. Like,
aren't you the nice one?
I am.
Yeah. So I really like this. First and foremost, I love the work of Ted McKeever already. And so I came to this wanting to like it, and I definitely was not disappointed.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too.
So before we get to the last title that we're going to discuss, Gwen, let's remind our listeners that, we're not quite an hour into this episode, so if our listeners feel like their attention is flagging, maybe they need a little caffeine in their life. And what better way to get your caffeine than Just Coffee Co-op? That's right, they're one of the sponsors of the Comics Alternative, as you heard at the top of the show. If you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, you can load your shopping cart with a variety of different kinds of coffee, all of which are fair trade, shade grown, and organic certified. And if you put in the coupon code COMICS, you'll get 10% off of that order.
And they have Divine Chocolate, as I said at the beginning of the show, and I want to just mention that one more time, Divine Chocolate.
You cannot let us forget that.
I will not.
Yeah. Well, something that is rather divine for me, and I know that that's a really sappy segue, is the work of Edgar Allan Poe, and in particular, adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe's work, especially as it applies to comics. I've done a bit of research and writing into adaptations of Poe in comics, and the most recent manifestation of that is a new version of the Cask of Amontillado. This is based on, of course, the original Poe short story. It's adapted, written by Enrica Jang, with art by Jason Strutz. And, as far as adaptations go, I don't know what your feeling is with adaptation in general, or maybe even adaptation within comics in particular. But, I mean, there are one of two ways of approaching this. I know many people look at adaptation in terms of the fidelity to the original, right?
Right.
How true is it? How honest is it to that original narrative, the original manifestation? And then another way of approaching this is, what does the adapter, creator do with the narrative that they're adapting, especially given the uniqueness of the particular medium in which they're adapting? And I tend to privilege the second kind of adaptation to see, in what ways might creators take an original text and use the medium, in this case comics, to make it something maybe not very different, but somewhat different, maybe to tweak it, maybe to twist it a little bit. In other words, not to feel that they have to be 100% true to the original narrative, because if that's the case many times, I think that's where a lot of adaptations tend to trip up. Especially when you're going from one medium to another. So maybe from film to comics, or film to written text, or maybe you're going from, prose to comics or film. If you try to be as true as possible to the original, I mean, I think it's, possible definitely to have a really good adaptation. On the other hand, in another medium, there may not be the same mechanisms available, and so you can make the adapted text in your representation of that, I guess, a little limiting. Now, I think that Jang and Strutz are pretty spot on with the original short story until the end. At least in terms of the main outline of the Cask of Amontillado. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, absolutely. And one of the things that's interesting is I actually reread the short story. It had been years since I had read it, and it was just as creepy and awesome as I have to tell you that when I was a kid, my parents read me almost all of Edgar Allan Poe when I was a little kid.
They read you?
Yeah.
Edgar Allan Poe, really?
And everything else. I was one of those lucky kids whose parents just felt that, if they liked a book, I should get to hear it too. And so for me, these were my first ghost stories. And this story is particularly interesting because it ends so abruptly in many ways, and because the speaker in the story has basically alluded to an injustice that has been visited upon him. But by the end of the story, you never really know what that is. And so it's up to you as the sort of listener to the story, or the reader of the story, to sort of sort that out. Whereas it was very clear to me that the way that the comic ended was designed to set up the series that's coming, that will then work off of this and become a sort of gothic comic in its own right.
Yeah. Now, we didn't mention the publisher, and I guess I should have. This is being put out by Action Lab Studios, and it may have been last week, I think, this issue that we're discussing, the Cask of Amontillado, was released. But beginning in February, they're going to begin a series called The House of Montresor. So I assume, and there's even an ad for it at the very end of this issue of Cask of Amontillado. I don't know off the top of my head how many issues the House of Montresor is going to be, or even how much it's going to focus on the family and the background of what in the original Poe story is the narrator of the Cask of Amontillado, Montresor. But I'm interested in that, and I'm on board for those as well, because I do think of that also as an example or an instance of adaptation, one that's very different from what we're discussing now, but an adapted text nonetheless.
Well, the new series is going to feature a young woman who is the heir to the fortune of Fortunato. And so I think that sort of gives it a very hip vibe, right? And I'll really be interested to look at it. And really, tell you the truth, I went and read it a second time after I sat down, I read it through the first time.
What, the comic or the story?
The comic.
Yeah.
I read the story, then I read the comic. And as the comic started to end in a way that I hadn't expected, that's when I went online and did all this research and was like, oh, okay, this is leading into something else. And so now I'm really anticipating it. I think it should be interesting. And I love the illustration. And so I want to see more of that.
Yeah. Now, you said it's going to be dealing with his Montresor's daughter, or...
No, the way that it suggests is that their houses have been joined.
Right.
And that she is now going to be the heir to the fortune of the two houses. And she comes back home, and intrigue follows her. I guess she had been sent off to, as all young women were, sent off to boarding school somewhere or off to see the continent or whatever, and then to come back home to Italy. And so it'll follow then what happens to her. And from they only have a couple of panels that they're previewing, but it looks like she's not going to have an easy time of it when she gets back. So
yeah, because I remember seeing that solicited in previews back in, I think, December, and then in January, the most recent. I got a little taste of that, but not near as much as, let's say, you were able to discern by doing the web search. The thing about this current issue, the Cask of Amontillado, this one issue adaptation, two things stand out to me of how it's interesting and different from other versions or adaptations of the Cask of Amontillado. One is the lack of a narrator, which is definitely different from the original. And then the second is the ending. And I don't think it's really a spoiler to say that we do see Montresor follow up an act after he walls up Fortunato. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the story of the Cask of Amontillado, as you point out, at the very beginning of the story, Montresor tells us that years ago, and that's something that you don't get from this issue of the Action Lab comic, that this is a story that we know that it's a story that took place in 1796, but there's not a sense of the telling and the actual events. There's that much of a distance between those, the acts that took place and the acts of telling the story to the reader, which you get in the Poe short story. So we don't have a narrator who is recounting events that took place. We just get them unfolding on the page in front of us. But we also see Montresor following up his actions, because in the original story, he sees at Carnival in Venice one evening Fortunato, who, as you pointed out, had done him a wrong. We don't know what wrong exactly in the story, but he did him wrong. So what he tells Fortunato, who prides himself on being a wine connoisseur, especially when it comes to a specific kind of wine, Amontillado, Montresor says, I just happened to get a batch of Amontillado in. I don't know if it's the best, but I thought I'd tell you. Now that I think about it, I'm going to ask someone else, because I know that you're busy right now and you've got a lot going on in life. And of course, Fortunato says, no, Amontillado is my, my favorite. I am the expert. Don't go to any others. And so Amontillado, who is a little inebriated already, and he's in the party spirit, goes with Fortunato or Montresor into his home, down into the catacombs, where he has stored the wine. And there's this, Gothic descent, down into the depths. And of course, metaphorically, the depths of the soul, the Gothic darkness and all of that. And then what Montresor does is eventually walls Fortunato. He chains him up and he walls him into this space, literally walls him up with bricks, and mortar, and he leaves him to die. Now, that's how the story ends, for the most part. There is, in the end of the original short story, the narrator Montresor does say that, that jingling sound of Fortunato, because Fortunato is dressed as a jester, right? And so I think that's interesting in the story, that both his name, Fortune, really, and the fact that he's dressed as a jester during Carnival, or rather ironically played out in the story, that sound of the jingle seems to follow him. And all these years later, it stuck with him. Now, that's how the story ends. Something else entirely, though, in this issue from Action Lab.
Absolutely. Something very different. Yeah. And I don't know if we want to give it away to our listeners or not.
Yeah, but it does involve another member of Fortunato's family.
And it does set up, I think, the series that will follow. Mm-hmm. And so, I just want to point out about the jingling for a minute. If we talk about adaptation, the actual line that has always stuck out with me in this story is, "The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode." And this is really Montresor talking about Fortunato's inebriation, but also it makes the way that text is structured, it makes him seem like such a fool. Mm-hmm. Such a bumbling fool who doesn't realize that he's basically willingly walking to his own demise. And there's a way in which in the comic itself, and again, we don't have the page numbers on this one, but the way that that this particular segment is rendered visually is not only sort of the very drunk Fortunato, but the way that jingle, the font that's used for it, mm-hmm. really does that sort of satiric sort of dig at Fortunato really, really well. So there was one moment where I thought that the visuals actually underscored something that I had already sort of remembered and found to be interesting in the story. So
yeah. Now, in the comic, I get a clearer sense that Fortunato realizes his fate. Mm-hmm. More than I did in the short story. And this is rendered in the art. And again, I'm not saying that this is better or worse because it does or doesn't adhere close to the original. But it's just an observation that with the visuals, the way that Strutz has drawn, and again, I don't have a page number, but there's one page where there's, relatively speaking, a close-up of Fortunato as it looks like he's breathing loud or almost yelling, "Ah!" And then that following page, he does look like he's screaming. And of course, the "ah" is strewn across the page in 3 or 4 strips. But there's this close-up of his face where it seems to me that he realizes the dilemma that he's in. But in the story, even up until the very end, arguably even with, "for the love of God," when he calls out at the end, that even then he may not be completely aware that this is not a joke, that Montresor is playing on him. So the comic, and I think most comic adaptations of this story, and there have been several, tend to do the same thing, is they ambiguize, if we want to call it that, they unambiguize Poe's original narrative. Because one of the things that I absolutely love about Edgar Allan Poe's writing, his novels as well as the short stories and the poetry as well, is the romantic irony that's going on in that there is a teasing out of meaning, but at the same time there is a taking away of potential reading that we don't know exactly what's going on or what a reaction is or how to interpret an event. Did it or did it not take place? Was this or was this not a reaction of a particular figure in the narrative? And, that's perfect for prose, but in comics where the visual is so prominent, it leaves less, I guess, opportunity to muddy the waters of the story.
Yeah, and another thing that I noticed, and again, it's not necessarily a criticism, I noticed that the characters are drawn to look like younger men than I had envisaged them to be from the short story. You get the sense that in the short story, these are middle-aged men at a time when being middle-aged was actually being elderly, right? This was, as you said, set in the 18th century. It was actually published, I believe, in 1846. The story was published. So, this was a time when the life expectancy was much shorter. And you just get this sense that both men have lived long enough that it's possible one of them has done the other wrong. I mean, there is that potential for that there. Whereas in the comic rendition, they looked very young and vital, and I don't know. So it was one of those things where when I got to the comic, I was like, oh, okay. I had to orient myself at first because the first scene is set in a fancy dress ball and carnival, and I had to sort of separate through and really figure out who the protagonists were because they actually looked more, to me initially, I was looking for some older guys. So there's that too.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But I think that, what you mentioned earlier, where the creators are going here as this... Right. as a springboard into this new series, The House of Montresor, that, maybe that is why they're doing this. They are euthanizing, so to speak. That's not the right word, I know, but they're adding youth to
given our show's topic today.
Wow, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, whoa, Derek,
speaking of that's a Freudian slip.
That was
maybe
awesome.
maybe there should be a psychiatric volume for the graphic medicine series. Yeah, I can see that. I want to come back to this lack of narrator. I mean, to me, one of the things that I love, not just about the original Cask of Amontillado, but almost all of Poe's writings, is that the narrative voice does potentially problematize our interpretation of what happens, right? And I think, that's definitely intentional. That's what Poe was setting out to be. And again, I don't want to suggest that this is a better or lesser adaptation than the original because it doesn't do the exact same things. I do think, though, that this story loses a little bit by not having that sense of a detached narrator years later recounting the tale. On the other hand, narration, especially first-person narration, is not the easiest thing to do in comics. Kind of like film in many ways. Although I think it's much easier to handle in film than in comics. It can be done, but I guess I can understand Jang and Strutz's elimination of the first-person narrative voice recounting a past event, especially in light of where they may be wanting to go with this new series that will begin next month.
I agree. Like in the last paragraph of the story, the narrator says, "My heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so." I mean, that sort of ambiguity, I think, is really important in understanding the culpability of the character, his motivations, how he will feel subsequently. I did miss that a little bit, too. Let me put it to you a whole nother way. If this had been my very first encounter with this story, I would have enjoyed it. I would have been able to follow it, but I wouldn't necessarily have, I wouldn't have the same feeling about the story as I did from the text-only version, the original, and so that's really it. But again, I'm still very much looking forward to the next sort of series. And I will also say I really did feel that the style of the comic helped to both put forward the feeling of Carnival in ways that the original story did not, right? Mm-hmm. It's visually stunning. The sort of ballrooms and the excess and the wine and the light, and the catacombs themselves.
Yeah, the architecture of the catacombs.
Yeah, I mean, that I found, and of course, the geek in me immediately was thinking about the amount of research that it would have taken to be able to draw those in a what I hope is very realistic fashion, because really the description of them in the short story, it's not nearly as detailed. And so I actually really enjoyed that part of it. I found it to be fascinating. So.
Right. And another thing that the art does, it brings out the Gothic quality of the story, which I really do appreciate as well. Mm-hmm. Again, even though it doesn't do the same things or some of the same things as the original short story does, that's fine, because I'm much more interested in what adapters do with an original and then making it their own. So I like where both Jang and Strutz are going in this issue of the Cask of Amontillado and then into their next series, with this one exception, and I do have to point this out. The very last page, when Montresor, and this is not a spoiler, when Montresor is talking with Fortunato's wife, and she is wondering where he is, and she says, "I'll never find him in this madness," meaning the carnival. And Montresor says, "No, dear lady, nevermore." Now, okay, had Jang, as the writer, left out nevermore with, Montresor's response, "No, dear lady, you won't," that would have been fine. The fact that we had to have this gratuitous insertion of the Raven, which is how most people know Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, to me, that is a cliche more than anything. So it's a small stain on an otherwise good issue, an adaptation of the Cask of Amontillado. Why the Nevermore? I mean, I know why they were doing it, but Come on.
Well, also, he's dressed like a raven at the beginning. I mean, that's his costume.
Yeah.
And he's referred to as Raven. So, yeah, there were those moments of, intertextuality that probably were not necessary.
But the dressed as a raven, that's fine because that's at least a little more subtle. But at the very end, it's almost like if this were...
It's like that a big giant raven is saying nevermore.
Exactly. Okay, this is like, someone telling a joke, saying the punchline, and then to make sure that you know it's the punchline going, ba-dum, tss, with a drum riff and making that sound. So by saying nevermore as the very last word of this comic, the last word and the last image and the last panel, to me that went almost over the edge. But again, it's not the worst thing in the world.
No, and actually, like I said, I'll be very interested to see the original comic that will then come out based on this, The House of Montresor.
Exactly.
Again, February 2016, right, that it comes out. So We'll have to mark our calendars.
Mm-hmm. So, Gwen, we've had a lively discussion. We started off with a couple of comics through the new series Graphic Medicine, My Degeneration by Peter Dunlap-Shohl, and Aliceheimer's by Dana Walrath. And we should point out that Aliceheimer's will not be coming out until April. We got an advanced reader's copy, something to look forward to. Then we looked at two brand new issues of comic books. First, issue number 1 of Pencilhead by Ted McKeever. And then finally, Enrica, Jang, and Jason Strutz's adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. So, wow, we covered a lot of ground.
We have, and there are interesting connections that we didn't anticipate between among all of these. So that was exciting too.
Monsters, diseases, all of that.
I know.
Yeah. So, if you want to find great comics like the kind that Gwen and I have been discussing, one place to pick them up is through our sponsor's website. And if you go to Discount Comic Book Service, dcbservice.com, you'll find every single month a variety of great discounts. And you can also find some of the titles on Amazon. And if you do prefer to get your books through Amazon, make sure you do so by going through our Amazon Associates link. And in fact, if you go to amazon.com/Amazon, you'll see the link that I'm talking about. Click on that, and everything you get from Amazon during that visit, we get a little kickback. And that's a great thing. Take away from Jeff Bezos, give to the Comics Alternative.
That's right.
Yeah. And after you do get your comics, either through DCB Service or Amazon, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about what you're reading. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe, or you can call us the old-fashioned way. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
There are so many other ways to contact us, Derek. You might need a command center if you wanted to contact us in all of these ways at once. You can contact us by email at 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. And Derek, how can they reach you?
Derek at comicsalternative.com.
Well, that is pretty simple. But there's other ways. In case that's not enough, there's Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, and Pinterest.
That's right. And remember, we have that new Goodreads site as well.
Goodreads and YouTube.
Yeah, that's right. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com.
Well, Derek, this has been fun. Dare I say, never more shall there be so much fun.
Yeah. But see, that was intentionally funny on your part.
Oh, okay.
I don't think it was gratuitous at all. So, yeah. And, Gwen, I do appreciate you doing the weekly shows. It's been fun every now and again, you stepping in to do this, as well as your monthly shows with Andy, the Young Readers series. And in fact, the Young Readers show that went up late last week, I think, was just really outstanding. So, again, thank you for doing those.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I love talking about comics with you, Derek. It's been been a great deal of fun today. And as always, I learned so much from you and also from reading these wonderful texts. So thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Sure. And we're going to have other great texts to discuss in the weeks to come. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Gwen.
We'll see you later.
See ya.